Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Bowman, and I'm here representing the Manhattan Institute and wish to welcome you to what I know is going to be a very exciting and interesting financial leadership forum. My co-conspirator, Jennifer Pollum from E21, is here as well and will be closing our program. But I wanted to say really that this is happening in rather auspicious circumstances. If those of you who tuned into the speech that Barack Obama made yesterday to welcome Prime Minister David Cameron, which he signaled a revival of the special relationship between our two countries and the belief that there is hardly anything we cannot do together. So today we are focusing on doing together, putting right the challenges that we face in the financial markets, and particularly defending London, defending the city and New York. And we have a very distinguished group here to set us on that journey. And first of all, I should be giving the warmest thanks to our American delegation, which is led by Ambassador Boyden Gray, who was the special envoy to the European Union, and also special counsel to George H.W. Bush. It's a man of deep experience, and we're very lucky to have him here. And he's going to introduce our speakers. And our topic is a very small one: the global economy. And so I think we could be at that all day, but we won't be. We'll be discussing it for about an hour. And the rules of engagement are that Boyden will lead the discussion among the speakers, and then the nice thing about being a group of this size is we'll encourage you to bring your own questions. So thank you very much indeed, and I think we're in for a treat.
Thank you. I want to introduce my panel and the topic, but before doing so, I want to correct Amanda in one small respect. She left out one of my many, many titles. It is true I was ambassador to the EU, but I was also a special envoy to Europe for Eurasian energy affairs. And this in Brussels was very special because there were very few special envoys. On my last night in Europe, before I left, I was packing up, so I couldn't go to this particular dinner, but I was asked to go to a dinner given by the commanding general of the European Defense Force. Now, that might strike you as something of a puzzle, since there is no European Defense Force. But he commanded a staff and a chef and a house, and I thought it might be interesting. He sent me a guest list, as I said I couldn't go, but I was identified as C. Boyden Gray, U.S. Special Convoy. I have on my left, who will begin, Guy Sorman, who is a contributing editor of the Manhattan Institute City Journal, and he will start off, to be followed by John Allison, who is a businessman, and I'll let him describe exactly what he does, but highly successful and a former academic, which is a great combination. Randy Quarles of the Carlyle Group, formerly of the Treasury, managing director of the Carlyle Group, and then Neil Record, who's the chairman and CEO of Record Currency Management. I'm going to try to keep my remarks very limited. I want to see discussion to try to narrow the topic a little bit, a discussion just about regulation. I hope we can keep taxes out of this. Maybe impossible, but regulation involving the banks on the one hand and the rest on the other. I want to see both discussed. In terms of the banking regulation, what do we do about coordinating with Great Britain and the rest of Europe? What do we do about Dodd-Frank in the United States? What do we do about too big to fail? How does that affect the flow of capital and the availability of credit? And then at the other end, on the demand side, maybe if you want to call it that, I would like to see an answer to the question, who was the sick man of Europe just 8 years ago, and what did they turn around to become the rock star of the world, and why can't other people in Europe do what they did? So that's the second question. Now, all of you must know who I'm talking about. Who was the sick man of Europe 8 years ago? Germany, right. But they're no longer the sick man of Europe. They're the envy of Europe. So what happened and why? So, please, Guy.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm a bit embarrassed because I'd like to answer your question directly, but I look at the title, at the program, and which he mentioned the path to recovery, and also yesterday night explained to me that one of the purpose of the meeting was to come in defense of free market and capitalism. So maybe before I answer the specific question on the sick man of Europe, I just want to make four remarks. I'm sorry this comes from my academic background and years of teaching economics, but it will be very short. But thinking of this meeting this morning, four remarks came to my mind, which are a bit general, and then I come to your specific question. About the path to recovery, my first observation, all of them will look maybe a bit counterintuitive. That first remark is recovery in economics, in a capitalist economy, is inevitable. Of course, capitalism and free market go through business cycles. I prefer the notion of business cycles, which comes from Schumpeter, better than crisis. Because when you talk about crisis, it's a Marxist term. It's about the final crisis of capitalism. And I don't believe in the final crisis of capitalism, but of course business cycles do exist. And we always are able to get out of business cycles. It is inevitable, and more so for two reasons. Because there are more and more entrepreneurs around the world. Because of emerging markets and the entrepreneur being the engine of recovery, the sheer increasing number of entrepreneurs brings a certainty that we'll be getting out of this bad business cycle. Another reason why capitalism is always recovering is because the other engine of recovery beyond entrepreneur is innovation. And innovation actually is the real engine of growth. And innovation is a cumulative, it's cumulative. In the world today you have more and more innovation, and you will have more and more innovation. This is mathematics. And because of this combination of increasing number of entrepreneurs and increasing number of innovation, recovery is inevitable. You just can't stop it. My second remark is that capitalism, remarkably enough, is able to survive bad policies. And you mentioned a number of bad policies. I can assure you that capitalism will survive these bad policies, and it did it before. I want to mention a remark made a long time ago by my former a French economic professor, Raymond Barre, who also was prime minister for 5 years. And Raymond Barre always explained to us that a bad policy which goes on for a year is better than a good policy, than a short-term good policy. Because entrepreneurs, basically, they have long-term view and they need to adapt. So if they know that the policy will be bad for years to come, and the tax regulation, they will be able to survive because they will adapt. If the policy is good, but only for 1 year, it's useless. Okay? So he would advocate long-term bad policies, and which, by the way, he did when he was a prime minister. He had an excuse that was in 74, all policies were bad in 74. Okay. My third remark now, I come to the defense of capitalism, if this can be possible. Capitalism at best is likable. I'm not sure capitalism is likable. It's not likable because, as Hayek says, capitalism is efficient. It's not necessarily fair, it's not necessarily ethical, it's only efficient. And efficiency is not that much likable, and the reason why it's not that much likable was explained a long time ago. Sorry, I quote another French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, in 1830, who explained that the bad aspects of capitalism are evident. people are fired and terminated, and industries are closed, and all their activities are suppressed. You can see that, okay? He made the distinction between what can be seen and what cannot be seen, okay? And what cannot be seen, of course, are the new activities and the new enterprises which are created. And Milton Friedman came back on this and always explained the asymmetry within capitalism. He always explained that a company which is closed has prime time coverage on television, a new company which is created, first of all, you don't know where this company is, so you can't show it on television. And Milton Friedman always explained, you know, and it was the same as Frédéric Bastiat's argument, that capitalism is not likable because what is destroyed has more coverage than what is created. And this goes, of course, to the core of the Schumpeter argument, which is destructive creation, which in a way is at the center of the American political debate right now. And destructive creation creates this kind of asymmetry. What is destroyed is very evident. What is created is nowhere to be seen. It's somewhere, but you can't show. I mean, Romney, when this question was asked, of course, what has been destroyed is evident, and he said, I've created 100,000 jobs, but you don't know where they are. And it's impossible to know, in a way. So the Schumpeterian notion of destructive creation increases this asymmetry, which already had been underlined by Frédéric Bastiat and Milton Friedman. Fourth and last remark, and Nigel Lawson, I think, underlined that yesterday night. I mean, the defense and promotion of capitalism is not very good. Not very good, especially in the West. I mean, capitalism, in a way, is more popular in Asia because the positive results of capitalism are so evident in countries like China, like South Korea, like Taiwan, that people rather like it, okay? And in the G20, the most dynamic promoters of capitalism and free trade were the Asian countries, the emerging countries, much more than the Western countries, because they know what poverty is. And they were able to explain to the Western leaders that capitalism was the way which allowed them in 30 years to get out of poverty and to reach, you know, a decent level of life. So what do we do bad in the West, to just focus on the West? First, education about economics in general. I did, at the request of the French Academy a couple of years ago, I did a research on how economics was taught at the college level, not the college, what we call the lycée, which is high school level, okay? And I went through all the books with the high school students were reading, how economics was taught to them. It's a complete disaster. I mean, basically, it was Marxism, not to get into detail. And the conclusion of my report was to say, well, it's better not to teach anything than to teach that. But this has consequences, because this shapes the public opinion. And the public opinion is being shaped by what you learn when you are 15 or 16, and you keep this in your mind all your life. And this shapes also the mindset of the politicians. So education, at least in Western Europe, is a major problem, where the way we teach economics is largely dominated by a Marxist view of the world and Marxist interpretation of the economy. And we are not dealing with this so far. Now, I'm not enthusiastic also about the way many, I'm sorry to say that, free market or pro-capitalist foundations are promoting capitalism. I think very often there is the promotion is too rude. I mean, there is a lack of compassion. And if you come back to Schumpeter, I mean, the destructive creation, it does make victims, okay? And we have to accept some kind of social policy. Of course, it's always fine-tuning, you know, and not to bring too much disincentive in the economy. But we have to take care of the people, especially in a democracy. And I would advocate, I mean, in an essay which is going to be published in the next issue of the City Journal, I propose this notion of compassionate capitalism. It will ring a bell for you, okay? From compassionate conservatism to compassionate capitalism. So these were my 4 introductory remarks. And now in the half a minute, I want to answer your question about the sick man of Europe, about Germany. And what Germany did under a social democrat government, basically, was to reform the labor law, okay, to introduce flexibility in the labor law system and to negotiate with the trade unions so that the wages would be under control. And the success of Germany comes from this reform of the labor law, introducing more flexibility and being able to control the level of the wages, which has made Germany more competitive. Other European countries have not been able to do that. Why? Because, I mean, the notion of consensus is quite well accepted in Germany. It is not, especially in a country like France or Italy or Spain, where we have a tradition of class warfare. So we have to, economy is a science, of course, but you have to take in consideration the culture of the various countries. And when the political culture is more on the side of class warfare than on the side of consensus, the kind of reform which has been implemented in Germany is not that easy to implement in a country like France. And also, Germany is a relative success. They are doing very well, in export markets for reasons which have to do with the German tradition, very dynamic, medium-sized enterprises. I mean, they are very specialized with high technicity and well recognized. France, on the contrary, is dominated by 40 big companies which always worked closely with the governments in the 18th century. So economics, you have to be very careful when you look at the country and say, well, why don't we why is not France or Spain like Germany, okay? Maybe the economic policies are different, but I insist on the fact that we also need to look at history, local culture, traditions, structures. And one final remark about Germany. Germany is heavily regulated on the domestic market. It's extremely difficult to become a hairdresser in Germany, for example. You need to go through exams and so on. So Germany is a success on export market, but it's still a very regulated economy domestically. I don't want to elaborate on Germany, but I just want to say that in the defense of free market and capitalism, we always have to take into consideration history, culture, public opinion, and try to fine-tune and deal with all these elements and not to conclude that one rule fits for all.
Thank you very much. I've never heard such a concise and yet comprehensive review of Germany. Amazing. John, Allison, do you want to, do you dare?
That's why Guy went first. Also, he had to introduce the fact that I did try to become a hairdresser in Germany. I failed. That's why I ended up doing what I'm doing. But in any event, no, it was very good. So, actually, I think many of us were not quite sure what we were going to talk about. So I'm just going to talk about something that Amanda said I should talk about, which is along the lines he was saying, which is what is the future of capitalism? Should capitalism defend itself, and so on and so forth? So I will address that. Before I do, I just wanted to say one last thing on the Germany issue. Well, because we ended on that. I think Guy covered it, but there's another thing, and that is that there has been a huge macro benefit to Germany from emerging markets, China, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So here's a country that exports over 40% of their GDP. They're very, very dependent on that. And they happened, and this is not to take anything away from the Germans, but they have lucked into a great environment. And as anybody, I'm an investor and business person, anybody knows, as these gentlemen I'm sure know, being at the right place at the right time covers a multitude of sins. So I'm not taking anything away from the Germans. I'm not quite sure that the geniuses everybody says they are. I think they happen to be in a good spot, and they did a number of things that positioned them very well. The problem with Germany as a model is that we cannot all be exporting 40+% of our GDP. Anyway, that's my German thing. Okay, so what I wanted to, I'm going to take a slightly, and I'm not an iconoclastic person, but maybe something that'll seem iconoclastic. Let me preface by saying that as a person, I am a capitalist in the extreme. I do all the things that people like to think capitalists do, like I take risks and I put my own money, I fail, I get up, all those kinds of things. So what I'm about to say is certainly not taken from a socialist perspective. I think we talked last night about capitalism defending itself. I actually think the problem with capitalism is not what it was 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, it was kind of the capitalism versus socialism. Socialism had been trying its experiment for the previous 60 years. It was slowly failing. And then along came a number of people, Margaret Thatcher's, Reagan's, other people, the intellectual side. Hayek suddenly came out of nowhere and was revived, etc. And capitalism was sort of viewed now as the antithesis of this heavy-handed, suppressing, socialist kind of regime. I think we have a very different problem today, even though I know there's re-regulation. I think capitalism's problem is capitalism. And I don't think it needs to actually be defended, because I think the vast majority of people, and including people who don't really know much about business, somewhere intuitively know that this is a pretty good system for allocating resources. They may not like it, they may think there are a lot of nasty people running things, but the fact is they know the Soviet Union is not the way to go. And I think the problem with, so I'm going to talk about what capitalism's own problem is. The first is, I think capitalism, and I mean all of the practitioners, probably people in this room, myself, all the wonderful bankers out there, et cetera, have an overly narrow definition of it. Capitalism is really an allocator of resources, and everybody kind of stops there. But we all know, and even a guy, where's Nicole? Is she here? There you go. Yes. Even Adam Smith knew that actually there is another dimension outside of capitalism, and that is the moral dimension. Theory of moral sentiments and all that kind of stuff. And then outside of the moral dimension is the legal dimension. I often, liken it to a game. You all like soccer here, so let's take soccer. There's the game of soccer, people back and forth trying to score goals or defending it. That's capitalism. But then you actually have to have soccer players who sort of play by have the right attitude. You don't want soccer players trying to kick the other people. That's the moral dimension. And then you need to have a referee that has the rules of the game. And I think that part of the problem that we encountered in this last period is the fact that capitalism went about its business of allocating resources, but forgot the other two dimensions. And we had an example yesterday on the moral side of this fellow from Goldman Sachs writing his piece, but that's just one of many, many, many things that even people like us who are in the business know that there's often a lack of true kind of moral sense. What is moral sense? I give you a perfect example from these are practical examples. McKinsey, the great consultancy. The guy who started McKinsey had an ethic that the client came first, and they really did live it. They did everything possible to make the client come first. They didn't charge the client things if it wasn't in the client's interest, and so on and so forth. That was the beginning of the McKinsey culture. McKinsey thrived because this fellow said, if we do everything possible to take care of the client, everything will follow. You fast forward to the McKinsey today, and I happen to know this not just from reading, but one of the guys who's the director of my company was a 32-year veteran of McKinsey, and now you move forward, and the guy who's the head of McKinsey is arrested for insider trading. You have the Goldman thing. So the moral dimension is missing on a lot of fronts. Another thing that's missing in the capitalist thing is the self-regulatory side. People are very upset because the government's stepping in and regulating with things like Dodd-Frank, which is a horrendously bad bill. And it's 1,300 pages, that's the law, and then they're going to have the regulations. But to some degree, the whole banking system deserves it because they ended up not actually taking care of themselves in terms of pay, And you know, I'm an investor, and I'm not, but I see so many companies where you feel like the CEO is basically ripping off the company, whether it's at the expense of shareholders or at the expense of employees. A lot of that stuff goes on that you actually would be eliminated if companies actually regulated themselves, you know, somewhat better. Governance issues, and I could give you a million examples, but a company you would be aware of, Hewlett-Packard, you know, wonderful old name. I've known Hewlett-Packard for years. Have a moronic board that has spent years actually pushing a wonderful company with a wonderful history, and speaking of innovation, a true innovator, you know, down the wrong path. So I would say that the third problem, and I don't mean that this is not to sound negative, because I'm a fundamentally positive, very positive person. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But the other thing is that people talk, and Guy rightly talks about innovation, but at the heart of capitalism is actually allocating resources and better and better and better, and innovation is part of that process. I'm not saying we're not innovative, but I actually am concerned that the innovation we have is more and more derivative. That, you know, I have a son who's 18 and a half years old, who's started many businesses in his school, starting with selling painted baseball cards for 25 cents. All the quarters were actually seized by the teacher, but he's been, you know, ever since a very young age, he's been doing this. But I noticed he came up, he said, you know, he's at college right now, he said, I have, you know, this fantastic idea for doing this, this, and this on the internet. They were good ideas, but they were derivative ideas. You know, he wanted to have a better alarm clock, he wanted to do this, he wanted to do that. There's some real evidence that we actually need the basic microprocessor type innovations, the basic Bell Labs kinds of innovations, not just innovations that are taking the iPad 2 and creating a somewhat better new iPad, which I'm perfectly happy about. I think it's a great thing Apple is doing, but I wouldn't call it the heart of great innovation. So I think on whether it's looking at capitalism, the heart of what it does, which is allocate resources, I think it's got to actually be a better innovator. If it's looking at the moral dimension, I think there's a lot to be learned that we're not learning there. And in terms of regulation, actually capitalism has to become more self-regulating. Now, I want to say just a couple of other things. I know we don't have a lot of time here as to why has this happened. And then I want to say one other thing about the state, because I think that people look at the state as being kind of the opposite of capitalism. And I actually think that the state is helping, not always in a very good way, capitalism. So as to why is all that happening, I'm just going to give you two basic thoughts on the why, though it's a deeper question. The first reason I think all this is happening is the way people are educated, to go back to what Guy said. First of all, no one has any great education on economics, on capitalism, on business, and on the connection between all that and politics, philosophy, social life. I had two kids who went to at one time was ranked the #1 school in the United States, Trinity School in New York. Went to, whether it's #1 or #10, it really doesn't matter, but it's a good school. Absolutely, there is nothing at Trinity School that would possibly have educated these kids in any of the things I just mentioned. Yet it's considered a top school. My first son went to Princeton, terrific school and all the rest of it. He took economics courses and that sort of thing, but fundamentally he didn't really understand anything about the capital. He did take an economics history course, which sort of finally started to clue him in. He's now working for General Motors, and I've noticed that, and he was very depressed to work for General Motors. He thought, oh, it's a terrible company. I got interviewed there. They give me a job. It's a horrible thing. My friends are going to Goldman Sachs. Oh my God, you know what? It turns out, now he loves General Motors. He loves the fact that the company's trying to revive itself. But actually, he's learned everything he knows about business in the 8 months that he's been at General Motors. So I think one of the problems is we have all these really bright people. We have a very meritocratic society, but it's a very elitist-oriented meritocratic society. They're all going through this educational system so that they can become rich and successful and a star like the people they read about. But in the process of that, they actually don't understand how the system they're going to be part of fits into the whole, and they have no compass. And they get the compass, by chance because their parents may have it or because they pick something up. So I think that's one of the problems. The second reason is that too much has been expected of capitalism, and I'll give you this example. And this is not to focus on this this guy excessively. But in the days of Greenspan, in a certain sense, Greenspan did, I think, a great disservice. He gave the impression that capitalism was this magic thing, that if you just let it run, it would solve all sorts of problems. You know, the Ayn Rand idea. And it turns out that for the obvious reasons, capitalism can't solve all the problems because it is only that one core. It doesn't have the moral, it doesn't have the legal dimension unless you do something about it. So I think more was expected of capitalism that could deliver. And one of the things that it did not deliver was the proper management of risk. And it turned out that we had a horrendously bad, crisis. And we were talking last night about why everybody was so pessimistic. I think they're not pessimistic because people are naturally pessimistic. I think they want to be optimistic. But I think a lot of wealth was destroyed. A lot of risks that people thought were impossible came to pass. So I think one of the lessons has been you can't just let the engine run. The engine has to run in a context. Last and final thing I'm going to say is about the state. Because, again, historically it's been capitalism versus a state. I think in many respects the state is encouraging capitalism to create the excesses that we are suffering from. We've had 30, 40, 50 years of governments wanting to provide growth to their populations. In order to do that, little by little, they've had to take on more and more debt in order to produce the growth, because politically growth is essential. Now they've reached the point where they can't take on any more debt, so they can't stimulate to get the growth. So who has taken over this? The central banks have taken over this. I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago called The Keynesification of Monetary Policy. In many respects, the monetary authorities are the ones who are providing the demand to deliver the growth. The problem with all of that is that this huge amount of stimulation by the governments, the huge amount of stimulation by central banks, while it is perfectly appropriate at times of huge crisis, is creating a misallocation of assets that then leads to bubbles. And I personally think we are, Ben Bernanke, for all his wonderful intentions, is creating a new bubble, that we're in the middle of, and we're all going to look back on the way we did at the housing crisis, and we're all very aghast to find out, oh my God, there are all these bad assets out there. But in fact, the state is actually inadvertently, aiding capitalism in some of its worst misallocations. So I think actually the problem is finding a balance so that the state is in fact not doing these things and not encouraging capitalism to move to excess rather than to be more balanced. So those are my basic remarks.
You sort of cast off theory of moral sentiments too quickly, because it is at the heart, it's a basic building block, and people forget that. I think Smith thought that free markets were far more moral than government capture by special interests, and I think his ultimate nightmare was some Edinburgh businessmen capturing government for their own ends to exclude their competitors, and I think he thought that a totally free market was far more moral. And I think we ought to. There's a great book that's been written, probably not popular today, probably you don't hear of it at all, named The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, by Professor Friedman at Harvard. It's really quite an important book. So I think the moral component, of course, what the state did, John, was say in the form of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and housing policy, we don't care whether the mortgages can be paid back, just get the paper and we'll buy it from you. Well, who's not to like that, And but without the government doing that, I don't think we'd be in the fix. Anyway, I don't know who really wants to go next. Randy, why don't you?
Happy to. Let me. So there's time for discussion. Let me make just a few points, picking up on some of the things that Guy and John have said, and the basic framing that Boyden set for us at the outset. Focusing a bit on where we are currently as a result of where we've been, and on the regulatory side, which Boyden suggested be a focus, which I think is an important one because it gets less focus. So fundamentally, so what's happened over the last several years, when you boil it all down, was that for reasons that we can discuss at a later time, they're familiar to everyone here, you had a sudden contraction in the willingness of the private sector to provide credit to other private sector entities, and the government stepped in First in the United States, it's also happening in Europe. The government stepped in to substitute its balance sheet for the private sector balance sheet that was no longer there. That was done through mechanisms in the United States, such as the stimulus, such as TARP, very largely and in a much less transparent way by the Federal Reserve and the ballooning of its balance sheet from $800 billion at the outset of the crisis to now close to $3 trillion. And the Federal Reserve's mechanisms much less accountable and transparent, as I said. Now, the fiscal, that was a very conscious decision, certainly in the United States. That this was a plan. It was not purely reactive and people running around, there was a strategy. And what I think in the certain springtime in the market sense that one seems to have right now, many people are forgetting that it was a two-part strategy of which only one part was done, which is that the government would substitute its balance sheet in order to prevent a destabilizing, precipitous contraction in the provision of credit, and then it would manage that down in a more orderly way. And that second part still has to happen. It has not even begun, and the managing down will be a very substantial headwind to the economies of the developed world for a very long time to come. You know, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was immediately after the dark days of the fall of 2008, when it provided liquidity in a very rapid fashion and expanded its balance sheet to just over $2 trillion. Now, the second part of that is managing it down. That hasn't begun. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet right now, in fact, has gotten larger by about 50%. It is close to $3 trillion now, as it has continued to expand as opposed to managing down. At some point, that has to happen. The fiscal consequences on the on-balance sheet side in the United States, the doubling of the debt held by the public, again, during the short course of this crisis and on track for a significantly larger percentage of debt to GDP, that still has to be managed down. So you've got this strong economic headwind. There's actually been a lot of focus on that, although I do think people are forgetting that the second shoe still has to drop. But even more importantly, to my mind, are some of the issues that Boyden raised as a consequence of this firefighting that has gone on over the course of the last number of years, which is that we have once again moved to an attitude of government which emphasizes discretionary intervention over a rules-based, transparent approach, right? The Larry Summers mantra of temporary, targeted, and timely measures to address distress. The resolution provisions in Dodd-Frank for dealing with financial companies in crisis, which emphasize exactly what happened. Instead of saying that we found ourselves in a position where the government had to, query whether it really had to, but they felt that they had to step in and become a player in the game, as opposed to a referee, to use John's analogy. If we analogize it to a soccer game, well, the players are playing by the rules, you ought to have sportsmanship, and you need to have referees. Well, the government is supposed to be the referee. They found themselves becoming players. The policy problem ought to have been, we have to find some way that in the next crisis we can continue to let the players play the game and we don't have to, step in and start kicking the ball. Instead, they codified in a statute that in the next crisis, here are the ways in which we will become a player. That is a significant change in the regulatory attitude in the United States, which over the course of the previous 30 years, across a range of ideologies and partisanships and presidential administrations and different congressional compositions, had moved towards the view that whatever one's views about the objectives of regulation, the mechanism of regulation ought to be as generally applicable as possible, not targeted, as rules-based as possible, covering a variety of situations. In other words, not timely in the sense of here's what needs to be done this minute, here's what needs to be done the next minute, and not temporary, but as permanent as possible for the reasons that Guy said. Businesses need to plan, and policy needs to be permanent. And now the mantra that is guiding the government's thoughts about how it ought to act is that it should be temporary, targeted, and timely. That's not the way that government ought to be. Similarly, as John said, We have, because of the political obstacles to policy being temporary, targeted, and timely, we have started asking central banks to take over for the perceived limitations on the ability of the political accountable side of governments. That politicizes central bank activity. It obviously poses financial risk to the central banks. And finally, we have become preoccupied, and perhaps most dangerously, and what we have talked about least, I think, in the context of thinking about policy and the economy post-crisis or cycle, however one wants to call it, we have become preoccupied with stability rather than growth in the United States. The view that the Federal Reserve has not begun to manage down its balance sheet because it doesn't want to destabilize the situation. But until it does and allows the market to again begin sending signals about what is really viewed as an efficient allocation of resources, you won't have robust economic growth. That has to happen. We have to get rid of this overhang. We have to swallow that pill eventually and move on to the next situation. But we are preoccupied with stability. So let me turn that over to other folks.
Wow. I've been listening very intently. And of course, when you're last, you can't really plan your talk because everybody else has already said. So I'm summarizing very briefly what I think everyone has said. That Boyden has raised the question about the role of regulation and deregulation in the development or resumption of demand and the free play of markets. He's thrown that open to the group, and in 3 words, I would summarize that Guy has said, and I agree with this. I have a real problem because I agree with what everyone has said, that a bad but stable policy is better than a good but unstable policy. And I think that is a very deep observation about the way capitalism works. It works within a framework of the rule of law. And if the rule of law is shifting sands, then it's very difficult for it to work effectively. What John has said, in summary I understand, I think, is that the role of the state has in many ways emphasized rather than minimized the natural problems that capitalism can engender. And I think, again, that is very much something that I agree with. And I think Randy has really emphasized that again, and what he's said, I think, is that the role of the state is as referee, not player. Broadly speaking, it's the same as Guy. And that what is happening in the States, and I'm going to say, and you'll be pleased to only 3 minutes on this, what is happening in Europe is that the state and an arm of the state, namely the central banks, have become enormous players, not referees. And that is a fundamental destabilization and corruption of their core role. And I think that is a dangerous moment in the global economy. So you and I am amazed that we've reached 53 minutes of conversation about the state of the global economy and the path to recovery, and nobody has even mentioned the word Eurozone or Euro.
We're leaving that to you.
And just to remind you, beginning March 09 and ending May 10, we were all very optimistic. The markets had a tremendous recovery. We said, look, we understand the issues. There'll be a lot of deleveraging, but we've taken a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot more pain, that our governments have stepped up. They have made a number of our banks too big to fail, but nevertheless, they aren't failing, so our assets are broadly secure. What stopped that in its tracks, and what stopped it in its tracks, was the beginning of the Eurozone crisis, which is now, and this is amazing, it's nearly 2 years old. May 10 was the sort of start of the panic. It's March 12 now, and we have not even a beginning of a resolution. And I think at core, and I'm referring back here to Boyden, at core what we have is the largest, the most colossal regulatory, macro-regulatory system, which has fixed exchange rates across 17 independent states, which has prevented and is preventing adjustment, economic adjustment, and in particular what I call current account demand adjustment, in a 13 trillion dollar economy, 20% of world GDP. This is at the absolute core of why the recovery has stopped in its tracks. And in the crisis, what's happened, it's what always happens, that the politicians who are utterly committed, and I should say not the UK, American axis, but the European politicians, the central European politicians are absolutely committed to the euro as a principle, have twisted and turned to keep finding ways to keep the project, inverted commas, on track. And I mean, this is, to me, it's astonishing that last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a headline in one of the UK papers, probably the FT, that said, Greece successfully completes debt swap. That was the headline. What it should have said was that Greece has defaulted on 100 billion euros, or 130 billion dollars of debt, the largest ever, by the way, a tiny country, the largest ever sovereign default. And it's seen as a success. It's successful negotiations. So I think all of us, my colleagues here have said quite rightly that we have a lack of private sector demand. The private sector is frightened, and you can see how frightened it is because we have negative index in the UK, well, you have TIPS in the US, but in the UK we have index-linked gilts. They're a measure of what investors are feeling about risk, and we have negative real rates virtually across the curve. It's out to 30 or 40 years, negative 50 years, negative real rates. So we are terrified because we know the Eurozone is unsustainable. It cannot carry on. We've fixed a few years' worth of overspending by one small country. There are a whole lot of other larger countries. They've all been overspending and will continue to overspend because they are in huge external deficit with Germany, the great success story that is maintained. If you take 100 as the unit labour cost in Germany today, the unit labour cost in most of those other countries, ranging probably from 120 in France up to 160 in Greece, are wildly uncompetitive and they can't adjust. So in my opinion, and the opinion of what we used to be called a rather nutty, but now perhaps I should say perhaps iconoclastic group of city economists in the UK and the US, the Eurozone has to go. And in my opinion, the Eurozone will go. And it will go, I think, what I think it should do and what it will do. What I think it should do is I think it should go tomorrow. I think there should be a one-time, explosive reintroduction of all 17 currencies. It could be done in a week. I don't know if any of you are familiar that a gentleman called Lord Wolfson has put up £250,000, and that's a lot of money. It's $400,000 as a prize for the answer to an essay question. The essay question is: if a country leaves the Eurozone, how ought it to be organised to maximise future prosperity? And I wrote they haven't judged it yet, but I wrote a submission to that, and my assertion is this: the only way is like taking that plaster off on your hairy arm. You can do it very slowly, and it's manageably painful, but for a very long time. Or you can just pull, and it's all over. And there will be a great deal of pain. There will be a lot of insolvency, including most northern banks and the ECB. But we have governments, and that's their role. And the moment it's over, it's over. And then certainly in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, in the peripheries, we would have Argentina. And you may not like Argentina, but when Argentina defaulted in 2002 and its exchange rate collapsed by 3/4, it had 6% real growth every year for 10 years after that. So it became a huge economic success. And I agree, 2002 was a nightmare year. People were on the streets in Argentina, a lot of default and a lot of unhappiness. So it is the only solution. That's what I think ought to happen. What will happen is the opposite. I think we will have, like the common agricultural policy, this is something that Americans will be unfamiliar with, but the Europeans will be all too painfully familiar with, a system of controlled prices for our agricultural commodities that we produce that has been distorting our agricultural production for the last 60 years and which has been dismantled over about the last 30 years and is still the largest single user of our EU budget. So everyone acknowledges it's a complete waste of time and money, but it's impossible to get rid of. So I think we will probably have another 5 or 10 years of pain while slowly we peel off individual currencies. We have to sort out each of these currencies individually. And if and when we finally get to a point where we believe we have a sustainable environment, maybe a small northern euro, maybe a southern euro, or in my opinion, we should have independent exchange rates for each independent sovereign, then we will have a resumption of confidence in the stability of the system and the private sector. Well, as Guy said, recovery is inevitable. But we need the environment to do that for it to start. So with that, I'll hand it to
Well, this has really been, Amanda, thank you for putting together this panel. It's come full circle in a very productive and sort of satisfying way. Thank you, panel, for